हाँ, शुरू हो गया शायद। ओके, ये अभी आप हाईलाइट करिए हमें। हाँ, आप हम दोनों को हाईलाइट करिए और जस्ट कंफर्म कि आप मुझे फेसबुक के ऊपर देख रहे हैं।
यार इट्स ओके सर।
हाँ, ओके, तो दोनों को हाईलाइट करिए और मैं शुरू कर रहा हूँ
जी।
अगले 2 मिनट के अंदर। ओके, ये अभी आप हाईलाइट करिए हमें। ये नजर नहीं आ रहा है मुझे अभी तक। हाँ, यस, ओके, हाँ, ओके, ओके, मैं प्रमोद शुरू कर रहा हूँ। ओके प्रमोद।
यस सर, ओके सर।
हाँ, दोनों को हाईलाइट करिए। यस, अभी परफेक्ट। यस, थैंक्स अ लॉट। ओके, जय हिंद एवरीबॉडी। We welcome you to our second session on disruptive technologies. You would remember that we had met last Sunday. We had spoken on disruptive technology session, and in the first session, we had talked about disruptive technologies in non-contact and non-kinetic form. And the session was very successful. I want to thank all of you that we had a wonderful audience. There were a lot of queries. We had a very large number of people who viewed us on the Facebook. Also, we had at the same time we had projected it on the YouTube also, 2 channels simultaneously. That was also a great success, and a lot of questions have also come. I will take them. Some of them I'll request General Pannu to take them on, and the basic ones I will talk about it. Okay. So firstly, I want to remind you again that today we have with us again Lieutenant General PJS Pannu, who is PVSM, AVSM, VSM, and he's also won the Chief of Army Staff Commendation Card. And more important is, I want to remind you that he was the person who raised the Defense Cyber Agency. He was responsible for the Space Agency. Not only that, he's been a soldier throughout his life. He's been on, only on the border, either with Pakistan or China. Immense experience in Jammu and Kashmir, in the Northeast, China, and most importantly, in the present context, that he was a 14 Corps commander, which is responsible for a battle that is being fought against the Chinese in the recent past. So we have a very, very qualified person to speak to us on various issues. The session today is on disruptive technologies in kinetic non-contact warfare. Kinetic and non-contact. Okay, so to talk to us, we'll have General Pannu with us. But before I request General Pannu to make his opening remarks, there are 2, 3 very basic questions that have come up, which I will try and answer, then hand over the mic to General Pannu. First question is, people have asked, what is disruptive technologies? Can you explain to us once again? I would put it this way: technology is always is a very important component of any battlefield, and a side which has better technology always has an edge as far as winning war is concerned. And when we talk of war in the Indian context, we have a war with on the conventional lines. That is the kind of a war that we fought in 1947, 62, 1965, 1971, the Kargil War. These were all conventional wars. So all of you know a lot about it. And then there's another section called the unconventional war, call it the proxy war, call it terrorism, call it insurgency. And now what is changing is it is also called as hybrid war. It is also called as multi-domain war. It is also called as a warfare in which there are certain gray zones in which conventional and unconventional things overlap over each other. So these are the kind of wars, or these are the kind of security challenges which we are facing as a country. As far as disruptive technologies are concerned, disruptive technologies are the technologies which disrupt the way of thinking, the way you fight warfare. To give you two specific examples, the Air Force has fighter aircraft, and we always talk about Air Force's efficiency in terms of number of fighter squadrons that it has. It is supposed to have 44 squadrons. It is dropped down now to 31 squadrons. But all of a sudden, we have a new component called the armed drones, And today, drones has changed the warfare so much that in the recent war which took place between Azerbaijan and Armenia, one side had the conventional weapons, that is the tanks, the artillery guns, and the other side used drones in such a big way, it won the war. And today, and most modern drone will cost you to the tune of about 5 crore, 6 crore, while a fighter aircraft today, even the light combat aircraft Tejas is in the region of about 500 to 600 crores. A Rafale aircraft cost you something like 1,500 crores. So just imagine, instead of one Rafale aircraft, you can have literally hundreds of drones doing a similar task. So Air Force is in a dilemma. Should we go in for more fighter squadrons, or should we add some more drones to it? And to cut the long story short, they are raising now a lot of drone activities, lot of drone components to basically break the radar chain of the enemy. So that is something very, very disruptive. Imagine a fighter aircraft to some extent being replaced by a armed drone of a modern type. Then in the Navy, they were always obsessed with, let's say, aircraft carriers. They used to talk about sea control, sea denial. Now suddenly you have autonomous underwater vessels are there. And today there are hypersonic planes about which General Pannu, I'm sure, will talk to you about. So today people are talking, do you require an aircraft carrier? Can an aircraft carrier be targeted by hypersonic weapons from a long distance? Because they are very, very powerful. As far as the army is concerned, it faces a vast challenge on the frontier, land frontiers about nearly 1,600 kilometers, 16,000 kilometers, and sea frontiers of about nearly 7,600 kilometers. How do you look at it? So there are drones which help you in Recce. There are drones which help you in so many things. So I just try to explain to you the the disruptive technologies, which is completely changing our views. Now I'll come down to the second part, kinetic and non-contact. What is kinetic? Kinetic are the ones in which we use kinetic weapons like our arms, which are with us, artillery guns, missiles, etc. And non-kinetic is everything else in which physical weapons are not used, okay? But still you are able to defeat the enemy by targeting his systems which are behind with the help of electronic warfare, with the help of cyber warfare, etc. So I'll not get into too much of detail, and I'm sure all of you are looking forward to listening to General Pannu. So I will request him that in today's session, maybe we could look at it from 2 points of view. One is the conventional war, and second is the unconventional war. So may I request now General Pannu to talk about this second session, the kinetic non-contact warfare, which we could look at. So I request General Pannu to now make his opening remarks, and then we'll continue the session. Over to you, General.
Thank you, Brigadier Arjun. It is a pleasure for me to again come on this platform, Savarkar Smarak, which we discussed in phase 1, non-contact, non-kinetic part of the warfare. Now, when we spoke about this, we also said that if the war is not even declared, but it is being fought, it means that without declaring a war, how can you win the war? And we spoke about the Sun Tzu theory of winning without fighting. So we covered all those disruptive technologies where the soldiers do not come in contact and militaries do not come in contact, and there is no use of kinetic energy. As a result, the disruption is caused in the systems of a nation, where a nation is made to fail, where the kind of deterrence is put, the fear is put across that you cannot fight this adversary. So as a result, the aim is to fight a war and win it without actually declaring it. Even the hybrid situation comes into it, where sometimes special forces get sucked in. Sometimes it may even have limited kinetic applications in the hinterland. Proxy war situation, when you talk about strikes such as Balakot strike, or even strike where the raids are conducted by the special forces. So that goes into the gray zone, but there is a kinetic part in the whole thing. So in that gray zone, as Brigadier Mahajan was talking about. Now, today we are going to talk about the non-contact and the kinetic, which is the second step in warfare. Once the adversary has put you through the first part of the disruptive technologies and you find that the nation is intact, everything is fine, the adversary has been able to defend itself well, and nothing much has happened to a nation where you can declare a victory, then should the adversary who's on the offensive want to continue with that warfare, when you talk about unrestricted warfare, then the other means come into it. And should the escalation happen, then the next step is to shape the battlefield. Now, this entire phase can also end at just about shaping the battlefield, because you're using technology in which you're using the precision strike from standoff ranges. You're also using, missiles which are hitting very critical areas to make sure that the combat soldier, which is in the front line, is completely isolated and dislocated. As a result, the preparation of the combat soldier on the front line completely gets destroyed, because there is no supply coming from behind. The forces cannot switch, laterally, because, some amount of disruption would be caused by this kinetic attack between the areas, that the switching of forces will not be possible. Certain bridges would be destroyed, certain areas would be blocked. So as a result, the aim is to make the enemy completely crumble even before the bullet is fired face to face. Now, we know in the history in 1991, the Gulf War I was fought. Literally speaking, there were no boots on ground. Gulf War I was fought with missiles and air power. And that is precisely where they tried to win the war, and they also declared the victory. But since the boots could not, be put on ground, they had to go to the second phase, that is Gulf War II. But if you are talking about the entire background of warfare, I suppose Gulf War I would be a good example, where we all saw it was a media warfare, it was information warfare, everything was there, demonstrating technology. And also, I think a lot of new equipment gets tried out. The number of defense suppliers and the companies which are manufacturing the arms also try to field the weapons. A nation which has a manufacturing hub had the competence to convert the research and development into prototypes. Even those people come and start using those technologies. So as a result, there is some amount of misses and hits. But the point is that whole lot of arsenal then comes into play. Some are disruptive, some are conventional, but the whole might of the nation comes in. You spoke about what is disruptive. And disruptive is when you are making the entire adversary on a back foot, because whatever he had planned has become redundant. His tactics has become redundant. His strategy has become redundant. His equipment or technology has got redundant because there's something new that he's facing. So that kind of a disruption is caused, that he's caught fighting ill-prepared, and he cannot match up to the new dimension of warfare that all of a sudden gets introduced into the battlefield, or it is beyond the battlefield. So that is what I thought I'll give you as a background.
Thanks a lot for your opening remarks. I'm tempted to ask you two very basic questions, and you could give your opinions on that. When we had Operation Parakaram, you're aware that Operation Parakaram, the Indian Army was mobilized, and we almost went to war. I think almost about 7-8 months we were almost in our concentration areas wanting to go to war, but war did not take place because of many reasons which we'll not discuss now. But what I want to tell you is that time something very interesting thing happened. What happened was that 3 ammunition depots, I repeat, 3 ammunition depots caught fire. Ammunition depot at Dapar, ammunition depot at Bharatpur, and a convoy of vehicles going for mobilization. The convoy carrying ammunition caught fire. And what was interesting in that was the ammunition which got burnt in all this was the tank ammunition. And we all know, but for the sake of our viewers, that tanks are our offensive weapons. So what happened? Suddenly we reached a level where our ammunition level went down. So would that be a kinetic? Because suddenly there was no good reason as to why ammunition depot Dapar should catch fire, why ammunition depot Bharatpur should catch fire, why a convoy carrying only the T90 ammunition should catch fire. That was one issue. That is where suddenly we realized that we were short of ammunition, and if you don't have adequate ammunition, then possibly you can't go for a war. That happened in our context. And secondly, we have always heard number of times that as far as China is concerned, we have the Siliguri corridor, which links up the northeast with rest of the country, and there are a lot of reports that by various means, kinetic or non-kinetic, China will try and stop us there. So therefore, we got to have systems by which we are still able to fight in the northeast or on the Arunachal Pradesh area with the border against China. So could you comment on that? And also please tell us as to when you talk of kinetic non-contact weapons, as to what kind of weapons does China have, which is likely to be used in the Indian context? Because recently there was a report that they have developed, they have deployed a large number of missile systems in Tibet. I repeat, in Tibet. And anything which is deployed in Tibet obviously is meant for use against India. So maybe the Chinese weapon system in the kinetic non-contact context, which can be used, and also tell us as to if the threat from China is amounting to what you will tell us now, how is India countering it? So over to you, General Palman.
Thank you, Brigadier Mahajan. First, you gave examples of ammunition dumps going up in flames, and also you gave example of Siliguri corridor. These are the shades of gray that I was talking about, that in more so hybrid situations that we talk about, the difference between non-contact, non-kinetic to non-contact kinetic, these kind of disruptive actions will happen. And I was talking about use of special forces and irregular warfare. This can happen. Some amount of accidents also would happen, and there will be claims and counterclaims in the information warfare domain. But well, that is another matter altogether. Every enemy seeks an opportunity to claim victory. As far as China is concerned, in the Tibet region, after the disengagement that has been spoken about, it is known that the Chinese have actually deployed multiple rocket launchers, MBRLs in that area. And they've got different ranges, 100 kilometers to 200 kilometers of ranges. These are now actually practicing in Tibet area. It means when you do a demonstration, you're also saying that there is deterrence by punishment. And you must demonstrate to give credibility to it. If there is no credibility in deterrence, there is no deterrence. So number of missiles, number of rocket launchers or rockets which Chinese have there and demonstrate the firing, and then they propagate it in the public domain, it is basically to tell them that our deterrence is credible because we have it and we have shown it to you. So some amount of weapons are hidden and some amount of weapons are shown. Some amount of news is also leaked out. Some amount of defense manufacturing capabilities are also spoken about. For example, they have been advertising J-20 aircraft, which has not also qualified in the tests. But they have been propagating that they have this available, which is also 5th generation plus. But once you demonstrate it, you want to give credibility to the deterrence by punishment. But as far as India is concerned, I think at the moment we are at deterrence by denial. And we also have our MBRLs, we have Smirch and Pinaka systems, and we are also extending the ranges to it. So as a result, when one nation is showing the deterrence of punishment and another nation is showing deterrence by denial, it means that there will be some amount of checkmated deterrence which will come in. But we at the moment have not reached a place in our understanding of technology and capability that we can go into punitive deterrence. We have achieved punitive deterrence with Pakistan, but we haven't achieved punitive deterrence against China. So as a result, when you are talking about deterrence, deterrence starts even before you start doing, physical contact, that is contact warfare and kinetic warfare put together. The deterrence starts much before that. But after the kinetic and the contact battle starts, the value of deterrence goes, because it means nobody got deterred and they came down to fight. So as a result, when you're talking about non-contact conventional deterrence, that is where, when they have their own systems and you know that they have their missile systems, and in Tibet, of course, what is understood is that they have short-range ballistic missiles and medium-range ballistic missiles. The sheer number of missiles that they have in short-range segment is about 1,000 to 1,200. And they would use these missiles a number of cuts, to basically make sure that our forward air bases and our forward infrastructure, where major arteries are the ones which are targeted. But even for their medium range ballistic missiles, which are about 200 to 300 in number, but all these are not going to be deployed against India, because after all, their main front still lies in the east, in the South China Sea. And they would not want to deploy the large amount of systems this side, because Taiwan is also very close to them. And that also comes in the short range. The larger arsenal is actually kept, which is the ICBM and the IRBM capability, is basically against Japan, against America, against anything that happens, in the first and the second island chain. But there will be some amount of, usage which can happen here, where they are talking about the ICBMs. When ICBMs have a range of 5,400 to 13,000 kilometers. So whether it is deployed in Tibet or not deployed in Tibet, they can still very, very not only cover India, but even beyond, can go into Indian Ocean. So as a result, such coverages are there, and backed by a nuclear capability. The Chinese and the Pakistanis both have actually got their nuclear warheads ready, but none of them are deployed. China today is about 270 warheads of various kinds. And over the next 10 years, they are trying to scale it up to 450 nuclear warheads. Similarly, Pakistan also has about 120 to 130 warheads. These warheads I would say are basically for use by Pakistan. I think number of them would be proxy warheads. Initially, I think America used this as a base. And now the China might use this because a lot of technology has come from China. Why would Chinese want a nuclear warhead to be fired from their territory and get a retaliation back? They would use their proxies, such as Pakistan and North Korea, for this kind of a damage. And they would entice them into firing such, because the entire retaliation then would go on to those two countries. I think this is where, when you start talking about non-contact and punitive and deterrence, I think all put together, this is where we are. And of course, drone technology is something, and hypersonic technology is something that we can talk about in the next question.
Yeah, before we go to hypersonic technology, I want to ask you one specific question. What you have mentioned now is that kinetic firepower is distributed on, say, 3-4 fronts: against Taiwan, against America, against Japan, and of course against India. And they will make their own calculations as to how many fire units you want to keep in Tibet against India, and how many against Taiwan, and how many against this. So here I want to ask you one very specific question, that if you can find out, if you can understand, if you can estimate correctly as to what kind of a kinetic capability they have deployed against us, our response can be more accurate. So can we put it this way, that the battlefield transparency as far as India is concerned, with the help of our allies, without naming them openly, but call it America, call it Taiwan, call it Japan, do we have an accurate picture of what is the present status now? And should they move a certain weapon system from one sector to another? Do we have the capability to get to know from our allies that yes, so-and-so is moved from here, so maybe in this area he's meaning more mischief? Your comments on that, And then I would also wanted to ask you one more questions. Today, South China Sea is a place where they have become very, very aggressive. And the recent incidents was those 250, 300 fishing vessels coming in the Philippines Sea. And there was a very interesting news item that came that those 250, 300 fishing vessels which had come on that reef, which they claimed to be theirs, some reports said, especially from Global Times, which is their mouthpiece and which is also responsible for a lot of propaganda, that some of them were autonomous vessels, meaning they were unmanned. Just throw some light on kind of kinetic weapon system that they have used, deployed against the South China Sea. And every now and then they've been threatening Taiwan that we will do this, we will do that. And there have been, I think, a number of incidences in which the Chinese aircraft, fighter aircraft, mind you, crossed into the Taiwan airspace, and the Taiwanese on few occasions also their aircraft went into the air to challenge the Chinese. So maybe you can throw some light on South China Sea, some light on what is happening against Taiwan, and something what is happening against Japan, and then come back to my question, whether we can find out more accurately as to what is being deployed against us when he also has to fight a multi-front war. Janathan.
Brigadier Mahajan, thank you. As far as the South China Sea is concerned, I had spoken about the credibility in displaying what they have. Unless you demonstrate, there's no credibility. As a result, even firing or test firing or flying a few aeroplanes in that area to demonstrate that they are there, they are trying to extend the ADIZ, calling South China Sea as if it is a Chinese lake. They are trying to extend their Navy capability, building the second aircraft carrier now, which has been put down on water. They want to extend their reach to the second island chain, which goes beyond Japan and Indonesia. As a result, once they do anti-access, anti-denial, demonstration in this area, obviously they have been warning any surveillance aircraft of Americans or Japanese moving around in that area that they would destroy it. And they have also demonstrated, not that they hit it, but it is like somebody firing the ranging machine gun to say, if my ranging machine gun can hit you, the actual projectile can also hit you. Similar kind of a deterrence is achieved through a conventional warhead, that if my conventional warhead can hit you, all that I have to do is change it into a nuclear warhead because I have the capability and the delivery means to do it. So that kind of a strategy and that kind of a demonstration to make sure that it is credible deterrence, because they actually want deterrence against the Americans and the Japanese. As far as the collaboration in intelligence is concerned, I think the main advantage in collaboration is that, lately we talk about the Quad, is that the intelligence exchange is the basic intention where you start forging alliances, that you start exchanging the locations, the capabilities, the equipment, the actual, capability in whether it is demonstrated or how many numbers they have, whether it will fail or pass. All that information is shared with each other. And I think number of players are there, not only Quad, but we all know about those countries who are more than willing to share this information with us. So if their missile launchers are being moved, which are, some of them are moved by rail, some are vehicle mobile, all these are caught in the open because Tibet has no foliage, there's no forest cover. It is open, it is roof of the world. As a result, the satellite capability and the resolution available with the American satellites and now, or to an extent with the Indian satellite, is such that we exactly know how many aircrafts are there in each forward air bases, what is the movement of the train system, how much load has come, what kind of logistic system is there, and the capacities. So considering that, the Chinese have actually built a lot of tunneling systems, and there are such large infrastructure which is underground that for 30 to 40 days, they can literally go underground and have the logistics preparation done, maybe in the hours of darkness, but with technology, there is no real darkness today. But they would do whatever it takes to make sure that under the garb of supplying it to the locals, build population areas, like, along the border, they have started building some villages, and it is known. So basically, they want to camouflage the movement. They build village-like structures, but actually it is meant for the PLA. And you can see them exercising in those villages. And those villages are fairly modern. So as a result, when you talk about bringing missiles and other, kinetic, long-distance kinetic equipment there, more or less, it is known, and therefore one can plan and deploy the counter systems for it.
That was very reassuring that we have a fair amount of battle transparency and we exactly know as to what kind of resources they are deploying against us. Now, before we turn to hypersonic, maybe you can answer one more question. That a lot of times it is said that high altitude is very unforgiving as the weapon systems are concerned. The efficiency of, let's talk about the efficiency of Air Force. It is said that an aircraft which takes off from the Tibetan plateau goes up with only about 30 to 35% of the payload, while the Indian aircraft, where we have our airfields located in Assam and Northeast, Babdogara, Chabua and all those places, which are at mean sea level. So our aircraft go up with 100% payload, while the Chinese aircraft located on the Tibetan plateau go with about almost 70% lesser payload. My question is that, of course, is come in the public domain, and Air Force is also spoken about it, the air chief and people who know about it. But my question refers to the missile systems and other technologies like drones and all, the disruptive technologies which they have. What effect high altitude terrain has on their efficiencies? Because, we are all aware that even our tanks, even our APCs which are there, they get affected tremendously with high altitude problems, So just comment on the effect of high altitude weather on these disruptive technologies, and then we can turn on to the hypersonic weapons, because that's a very important facet of the disruptive technologies. General Panno.
As far as high altitude and super high altitude is concerned, Indian troops have been there for rather long, and our equipment has also been put to test for extremely long period of time. We have carried out fairly good modifications in our systems. So as a result, when you talk about these experiences, I think what is foremost important is that you look at the Indian military grade equipment. It means over a period of time, they have been tempered to a point that they can be useful for -50 and sometimes to -60 degrees. Some of them do crack up, but well, over a period of time, innovations have proved that they would sustain there. As far as the Air Force is concerned, you yourself said that the all-up weight in high altitude and super high altitude goes down by 30 to 40 to 50%, and that too if the temperatures go high, and temperatures can go high during daytime, almost to 30, 35 to even 40 degrees. Super high altitude rarity of the atmosphere plus temperature literally makes the all-up weight negligible. So therefore, literally either you can carry a full load of fuel or you can carry armament. You cannot carry both. As a result, if you're going to carry it 50-50, even that is going to be a very tough call. So as a result, the Chinese have invested in two things. One is that they would make their aircrafts fly from the mainland, and they would do air-to-air refueling. But the warning period that is going to be then available to us is going to be so much that we would know exactly where the air refuelers are and where their aircrafts are being refueled and where they would target. They would come with full laden weight for carrying the weapons and also a full fuel load and replenish it very close to the Indian territory. But that will give us fairly long period to offset this. That is why Chinese have invested hugely in the rocket force and strategic support forces, where they would bring in more missile systems to target us rather than depend on the Air Force. And Indian Air Force certainly has an edge over it. And if Indian Air Force and missiles put together the systems that we have, we also have Prithvi and Agni series available with us. And we have, of course, a good air defense system. And we have hybrid systems available in the air defense. And sooner than later, we are going to have S-400 deployed for our own air defense, which is the best air defense system in the world. I suppose any kinetic non-contact strategy of China would literally collapse. But Chinese have also purchased the same S-400, but that is to make sure that Indian Air Force also does not have the same advantage in high altitude as we have today. So it is a game which keeps going on, where one adversary is becoming punitive, the other goes into denial, and then takes over to become giving a credible demonstration and credible deterrence. So I think this is going to continue, and that kind of a warfare is on, in which the deterrence is going to be always at play.
Very well said. This game, chess game of moves and counter moves, is going to continue. Before we turn towards hypersonic weapons, which India tested last year, and it is supposed to be one of the biggest breakthroughs that we had recently as far as the disruptive technology is concerned. Also, when you go to the hypersonic missiles, etc., please also tell us as to what kind of a research are the Chinese doing to improve the performance of missiles, etc., in the super high altitude, because that is where they are going to be deployed. And then one can go on to the hypersonic weapons. So over to you, General Pannu again.
Brigadier Mahajan, when you talk about hypersonic missiles, they can be ballistic missiles, that they can go into the space and make a re-entry. They can go into space quickly and make a re-entry faster and then become more of a cruise missile. The advantage that a hypersonic weapon has is its speed. Well, the normal speed of a combat aircraft or a fighter aircraft is anything between 1 Mach to 1.5 to 2 Mach, depending on what generation they belong to. The hypersonic missiles start with 5 times the speed of the sound, that is 5 Mach. And they can go as much to about 20 Mach. Now imagine a missile which is gliding at that speed and also has a booster. This kind of a booster would mean that it can alter the speed and route. So as a result, the ballistic missile defense fails, because you cannot predict after the missile has been launched where the missile would be reaching at that time, because A, it alters the speed constantly and also alters the parabola. The parabola is also not predictable. So as a result, it can break through the ballistic missile defense and hit the target, and also can actually go into the cruise mode and approach the target from any direction, which is a great challenge.
Thanks a lot. I would like now you to comment on 2 specific issues. One is in the conventional war, disruptive technologies have a great use, and which you have rightly brought it out. Now America has been fighting a war near war in Afghanistan, and today they are technological superpower number 1. You name a technology and they have used there. But we know that in the month of September or something like that, they're going to go back from Afghanistan without achieving the aims which they had set for themselves when they came there after 9/11. So now, basically, the question that I want to ask you is, disruptive technologies in the Indian, how much of success the Americans could achieve in Afghanistan, which are the non-conventional battlefield, that is number 1. And number 2, the kind of a war that is going on for taming ISIS in Iran, Iraq, and all those areas, that is where another kind of a battle is going on, where all the world's technological companies carry out a lot of experiments. They prepare a product, try it out, and then they get actual worth as to whether it was successful or not successful. So please tell me, these disruptive technologies, what kind of help it provided to the Americans? That is number 1. And then after you answer this question, that we're talking of non-conventional fields, and then I'll go on to the other aspect. So please tell me, disruptive technologies in Afghanistan, in Iran, Iraq, and such kind of an environment as far as USA is concerned. Over to you, General.
Brigadier Mahajan, it is known that Americans would go somewhere where there is an American interest. So if they are interested in that area and it serves a purpose, not only directly for themselves, but also to deny the adversary a space, which is like Afghanistan, they want to deny somebody space. That was true for Russia. But Russia, at that time, Soviet Union collapsed, and the number of CAR countries came up, and the threat to Afghanistan was not the same as it was there earlier. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, I think the Russian interest also went down. Taliban was, of course, their creation, and Pakistan was partner in creation of Taliban, and they wanted Pakistan as a firm base for their operations in Afghanistan and that area. So one is the interest. But when you have an interest in that area and then you have a prolonged deployment, then the fatigue sets in. Or maybe the interest shifts somewhere else. Maybe the center of gravity of the interest has gone somewhere else. It has gone into Middle East, or now it is shifting, which is in the Pacific region. And therefore, now they're talking about the Indo-Pacific region, which is more of their interest than any other place. So when the interest shifts and the center of gravity shifts, then the fatigue level is seen that you cannot keep opening newer and newer fronts. You have to close the older fronts. So I think Afghanistan is one place where the interests are declining, the fatigue levels are higher, and the center of gravity of the interest is now shifting either to the Middle East and now more towards the Indo-Pacific. So as a result, such shifts will always happen. And who knows that after some time, if the Chinese go into Afghanistan, which is quite likely, how they're building their axis with Iran and with Pakistan. So I suppose some kind of a toehold will still be kept, and they would keep Afghanistan under watch through satellites and through UAVs, armed UAVs such as Predators. Now, Predator is something which they have demonstrated in that area, and then India is also now wanting to buy. So as a result, what happens is, one is experimentation, and second is huge amount of demonstration and advertisement that goes along with it. To have a credible deterrence, as I've been saying, some amount of demonstration is required. Unless you have seen the product actually in use, why would you buy it? So as a result, huge amount of warfare is sponsored by the arms industry. As a result, when the arms industry brings out a trial, and also they use the media to highlight, which is more of an advertisement, the media is actually not to sing the glory of the nation, but also to give credibility to the product, which is an advertisement. So I suppose the third world countries or the lesser world does not understand all that, and they create a conflict in which the arms industry would, come up to be a more profitable venture by them. So I suppose technology is something which the industry and the commerce would need. As a result, the disruptive technologies and warfare and the interests, I think there is large number of things which come together, makes the whole system very, very complex. Only a person who starts it and somebody who's a superpower and has got huge amount of money and resources to spend can keep experimenting with the world and treat the world as a toy. And the others will continue to suffer at the hands of such games being played, which is a great game.
Thanks a lot. What you have basically said is that the American interest is shifting from Afghanistan into Indo-Pacific, and today they perceive China as the number one threat. So therefore, they want to go toward that. And should a problem come up in Afghanistan because of China's coming inside, they would still have a toehold there, and they'll go back there should it be required again. Yeah, that's very well said. No doubt on that issue, and I would also agree with your sentiments there. One is tempted to keep on talking to you, but we already overshot our time by about 12 minutes. But I'll ask you one question, and then I'll request you for your final comments for today's session. The question that I want to ask is, when you talk of China, a lot of times, people in India, people outside give you kind of a feeling that the Chinese are 7.5 feet tall. They are not. They are just 5.5 feet. And an average Indian is 5 feet 8 inches. Now, the specific question that I want to ask you is this, that disruptive technologies, the biggest use China has made of disruptive technologies is not against India or not against their enemies, but against own Chinese people. I repeat, against own Chinese people. Today, talk of the kind of a disruptive technology, facial recognition, and kind of a surveillance that they're keeping on the Uyghur Muslims. Almost every Uyghur Muslim today is tagged. What he does is very well known. That is the best amount of surveillance ever done. Similarly, as far as Tibet is concerned, the surveillance network on an average Tibetan is so good that powerful AI tools are keeping a watch on every activity and everybody. Same is the case in Inner Mongolia, where something happening to Mongolia, they do it. And so basically, they have used powerful surveillance tools by using artificial intelligence in keeping a watch on their own people, whom they perceive as a threat to the Chinese rise. Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan, Mongolia, and I can go on. I would request you to offer your comments as to how much have they succeeded in trying to keep these kind of restful minorities quiet. How long will they be able to keep it? Are they falling into a trap when they become, and I'm tempted to tell you here, I mean, you of course would know it, but for the sake of audience, that in case of China, their external security budget and their internal security budget, if you compare it, then their internal security budget is almost 3 times the external security budget, meaning China perceives their own people as their #1 threat. While as far as India is concerned, the MOD budget, which is the external security budget, is about 2.5, 3 times the budget of MHA, which looks after the internal security. So your comments on how China has used this artificial intelligence and surveillance technology in keeping a tag of its own people, how successful have they been? And after you have commented on that, then I'll request you for your concluding remarks. General Pannu.
Thank you, Brigadier Mahajan. There are certain facts that China has done well on various accounts as far as the economy, the research and development, and science and technology is concerned. Their economy is almost, not as much as the US, though, they are claiming to be #2. But there is a lot more that they have to do to reach that level. So they are targeting 2050 as a time that they would cross as far as their economy is concerned. As far as research and development is concerned, they have caught up with the Americans in research and development. They're very close to them. And as far as the science and engineering graduation is concerned, I think today the number of publications and number of graduates in science and engineering is as much as the Americans have had. So as a result, there are plus points in which the economy, research and development, and China has become a manufacturing hub and is also exporting a whole lot of products, military or non-military, to the entire world. In fact, most of the drones in the world today, 70% are Chinese drones, which are being sent all over the world. The largest companies which are producing are the drone companies. So they are prospering as far as the research and development, science and technology to production is concerned. Now we're talking about the internal threat to them. China is very sensitive and they keep talking about one China policy. Now, what is one China policy? Obviously, they know that the world is not looking at China as one China. We are looking at Tibet as a region. We are looking at Xinjiang as a region. We are looking at Hong Kong differently. We look at South China Sea differently. And also, in the northern, bordering Mongolia, of course, there is always a problem. They are very, very conscious of the fact that they want the entire core of people who are today being considered as one China should be completely under the domination of one Communist Party of China. And when they see all this not happening, they are very disturbed. They want the entire world to acknowledge all these parts that I've spoken about as one China, which when it doesn't happen, then obviously there are problems with those countries. On the second side, when you're talking about technology and artificial intelligence, there is also a cosmetic growth. There is a cosmetic prosperity and cosmetic happiness, which they want to sell to the world. They want their own people also believe that there is cosmetic growth. So the number of publications and the data that they put across in the research and development, the successes that they've had actually are very confusing. And they want to make people believe that actually China has progressed much beyond they have. So it means they would want to cover their weaknesses and propagate certain successes which they've had, which are more or less cosmetic and superficial. But they don't want the Chinese people to make the outside world aware of the cosmetic, growth and these figures. So anything which the Chinese as people want to tell outside, they want to control them, even those who are outside. Students go out and businessmen go out, they're highly controlled. And people who are in the hinterland, in the China mainland, of course, are completely under control. They cannot move an inch. In fact, they don't have the internet system. They don't have access to Google. Everything is Chinese. In China, you cannot access an international internet. You cannot send an email outside China. Everything passes through their own Chinese, network, which is monitored, and the number of cyber warrior and the hackers that they have on them monitors each and every email which their own people are writing to one another. Forget about what goes outside. In any case, what goes outside goes through the national gateways, which are monitored by the Chinese government directly.
Yeah, thanks a lot. What you have basically said is that there's a fair amount of very detailed surveillance system they have created in their own country, keeping a watch on Tibet, on Xinjiang, Uyghur Muslims, Inner Mongolia, and other people. And in fact, one is tempted to mention here that a person who won a Nobel Prize for the country, a Chinese, some years back, the moment he won a Nobel Prize, the first thing the Chinese did was to put him in a jail. Otherwise, in other countries, when a person of that country wins a Nobel Prize, the media goes gaga over it. The government, sort of honors him, etc. I will now request you for your concluding remark on the session today, and then I will make last comments, and then we'll close today. Over to you, Janpan.
Thank you, Brigadier Mahajan. I think today what we spoke about is shaping the battle. Whether battle happens or not, but sometimes so much of disruption is caused in shaping the battle. So much disruption can be caused even before that, as we spoke about last time, that in non-contact, non-kinetic, there are many fields which disruption can achieve winning of a battle. When that doesn't happen, then they can go on to kinetic and still not go for contact. But in this particular segment of non-contact kinetic, basically the aim is to isolate, dislocate, demoralize, and disrupt, and completely upset the decision-making cycle of the adversary. The OODA cycle is completely thrown out of gear. As a result, there is no adversary to respond in a sequenced manner, because the mayhem gets created, and there is, of course, a layer where if there is a half a front of proxy war, where there is more hybrid situations created, some assassinations happening and kidnapping happening, and more chaos that gets created. So there, the layer of contact and kinetic has a good layer of superimposition of hybrid situation, which is half a front. I think this is something that one has to be very, very careful. And I think Indian strategists are very clear how to deal with each segment. Thank you, Brigadier Mahajan.
Thanks a lot for your concluding remarks. I'll only give two anecdotes which was told to me by my friends. The Chinese army was deployed in United Nations, and one of the biggest victims of the Chinese propaganda are the Chinese soldiers. They think that they are superpowers, and when the world knows that China is there, people should just listen to them and run away. To cut the story short, the country in which they were deployed, one of the African countries, the rebels there attacked the Chinese, attacked the neighboring battalion. The Chinese soldiers did not provide help, because they said, no, it's not our job. And next time, they attacked the Chinese contingent. And it is on the record that the Chinese soldiers ran away, because they thought that this African rebels, whichever country was there, would just not dare to attack China, because China is such a great superpower. And second incident was told to me by one of my friends who was deployed in Nathula. One day he heard, in Nathula, you of course know it, but the viewers may not know that in Nathula, the Indian army and the Chinese border is, Chinese army is, eyeball to eyeball. They're very close to each other. So one day the Indian soldiers heard a lot of dancing, a lot of shouting, a lot of singing on the Chinese side, So next day morning when they met each other, they were asked, why are you dancing? Why are you shouting? Why are you so happy about, what was the reason of happiness? So they said the company which was deployed at Nathula is going back, and all of them are going to leave the uniform, and they are going to go on the civil street. So their punishment posting is over. That was the attitude of troops which were deployed in Nathula, and it is on the record. Thanks a lot. We had a very interesting session, and a lot more questions have come up, but since we have overshot time, what we will do is we'll take on the question in the next session. And for the information of everybody, we will meet now on coming Saturday, that is 2 days from today, in the evening at the same time, 7:30 to around 8:30. And we will have the third session there in which we'll ask General Pannu to tell us all about non-contact but non-kinetic battlefield. So I thank all of you for your kind sort of viewership, and I thank General Pannu for giving us a very objective and a very well sort of laid out view on this kind of disruptive warfare that we are facing in the, today's context. Thank you, General Pannu, and thanks everybody.
Thank you, Brigadier Mahajan. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.